Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2024 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Christophe Courchaine. I'm the Interim Director of the Environmental Law Center, the Director of the Environmental Advocacy Clinic, and an Associate Professor of Law here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. We are very pleased to welcome you to the presentation today. As with our prior talks and our future talks, each one is worth one Vermont CLE credit. So please keep track of which talks you attend for your records. We'll have some time for Q&A after today's presentation, and for those of you who are watching live on VLGS YouTube, you may enter your questions into the chat space at any time, and we will try to get through as many as we can at the conclusion of the talk. Today, we're pleased and honored to welcome Heather Payne. Heather Payne has just begun her new position as a professor at the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State University. Previously, she served as a professor at Seton Hall University School of Law. She's a leader in the areas of energy law, environmental law, and evolving regulatory policy. A former chemical engineer and corporate executive, she brings a deep understanding of both the technical and economic implications of policies to address new realities in a carbon and water-constrained world. Previously, Professor Payne was a fellow and assistant director of the Center for Climate, Energy, Environment, and Economics, CE3, at the University of North Carolina School of Law. Prior to entering academia, she clerked for Judge Martha Geer on the North Carolina Court of Appeals and worked with Sears Holding Corporation and Honeywell International. Professor Payne holds a BCHE in chemical engineering, where she graduated with high honors from the Georgia Institute of Technology, and a JD from the University of North Carolina School of Law, where she graduated with high honors and served as a member of the North Carolina Law Review and symposium editor for Environmental Law Project. Professor Payne joins us at VLGS this month as the Distinguished Energy Law Summer Scholar. Today, she'll present how AI can help transform the electric grid. Most certainly a hot topic. So please join me in welcoming Heather Payne.
Thank you so much, Christophe. And let me go ahead and share my slides, make sure that everybody can see those. Okay, so how AI can help transform the electric grid. I mean, obviously, the use of artificial intelligence is spreading rapidly. And we're seeing that in all sorts of different areas, right? We're seeing either AI or machine learning being used or contemplated for use in wide-ranging fields. Things like hospitals, militaries, agriculture, transportation. We're already seeing it answer environmental questions. So things like which wetlands are still protected post the Supreme Court decision in Sackett. It's enabling better NEPA reviews. We're using it to monitor methane releases and find air emissions that would not have previously been found. We're using it for improved climate modeling. So the ways that we're already seeing it are helpful, but as we'll talk about today, really are just touching the surface of what this technology can do for us. Now, obviously, there are a lot of challenges that come with AI use. And really, the most significant one that is at the top of most discussions right now is how that is increasing electricity demand. And that's really the bulk of the conversation when we talk about AI in the grid. Right now, a lot of it is about the fact that we have this increasing electricity demand, and it's even more significant because of the fact that this is increasing peak demand. So we're seeing load growth for the first time, projections in some cases very, very high, 9 to 15%. Don't think there's agreement, certainly, on exactly how much additional electricity demand there is going to be from the use of these tools, but it is a concern. And the amount of electricity and that we need is really based on not just using AI, but training the models. And it also, again, is something that we are not seeing as a flexible resource right now, maybe in the future, but that's not what's happening. And so as we see all of that data center use proliferate, it is then having an impact on conversations around grid reliability. How can we continue, even with the reliability issues that we have right now, to sustain this amount of increasing load growth in our system and do it where we're maintaining reliability for the rest of the system? Now, again, it's not a done deal that there's going to be reliability issues, right? There's a lot of conversations about the fact that, well, we could actually see this demand as demand response resource, where when we see grid challenges, we could actually not use or not have data centers use their full capacity in that particular part of the grid. But again, not really sure if that is going to materialize. There's also conversations about the fact that chips could get a lot more efficient. And so that may, again, limit how much increasing electricity demand that we see. But right now, one of the main parts of the conversation is just how much we don't know, how much uncertainty there is around this, right? One study actually recently found that up to 9% of all US power production by 2030 could just be going to data centers, which is an astonishing, truly astonishing figure. Of course, that also then leads to the potential that we're going to maintain the fossil fleet longer to meet this additional demand. And so we may not actually see the transition to a more renewable, lower carbon grid because of the fact that we need to meet that additional demand that's coming from AI. And one of the things to note is that these grid impacts can actually be more severe because the loads for data centers tend to be clustered, right? These are not evenly spread across all of our different grids. Central Ohio actually is expected to see load growth of 20% a year, and basically is anticipating to have the same load as Manhattan by 2030. That was not in their plan, but that's what they're seeing now because of clusters of data centers that are asking to connect to the grid in those particular locations. Northern Virginia, because of a number of network just things coming together, is also seeing massive load growth from data centers. So we're seeing a real spike in certain locations on the grid that's having much more of an impact when we start thinking about load projections and reliability. And not surprisingly, where we see some increasing carbon emissions, certainly states are trying to determine if, when they have wanted data centers in the past, whether they should continue to have those friendly policies from an economic development perspective. And this is especially true if they're either dealing with a renewable portfolio standard that might actually be put at risk because of this additional load, or if they're water constrained. So data centers use, in at least some designs, a large amount of water. And so especially where we have states that both want to move towards a lower carbon or carbon-free grid and have water constraints, then these industrial installations can really pose a significant challenge for them. On the other hand, utilities pretty much have been very receptive to whatever increased load they're going to be seeing. For the most part, as far as anybody can tell, utilities are really looking at this as a new profit center, something that can bring a lot of revenue into their bottom line. And certainly, when we have had economic development tariffs for large electric users, the utilities have been very favorable to those policies. And in many cases, they're actually looking to continue to have those policies in place for data centers, even though, of course, in the past, the industries that would have been using that would have had significant job growth associated with it, which for the most part, data centers do not. But utilities see this as a revenue stream. They see it as a way to start making a lot more investments into their capital system. And so that's another part of the conversation that's happening right now. Along with that, there is a big conversation about what should actually be powering these. What energy sources should we be using for this increased demand? And the short-term projection is that we are just going to be maintaining fossil plants to meet this load, mainly because we can't get new resources to this scale online as fast as would be necessary. So while the hope, especially for some of these large companies who have made very significant commitments around their carbon footprints, we're still very, very early in terms of seeing how that is going to play out, how we're actually going to be meeting this demand if it's not just maintaining fossil resources on the grid. Let's move now, though, from kind of what's happening with the electricity use. That certainly is part of the story, but how we're actually thinking about using AI in the grid itself. And beyond just seeing the data centers as a potential profit opportunity, AI is already being used in our grid, and there are lots of other ways that is being proposed to be used in our grid. And there is very little doubt that we could have a lot of beneficial uses from this technology. I found this quote and I especially liked it. Possibly no industry has so many parts that so perfectly lend themselves to operation by artificial intelligence as electric utilities. And that is because, as we know, our electric grid is basically the nation's most complicated system, right? With all of the wires, with the infrastructure, with all of the different balancing authorities, the complicated jurisdictional questions that arise, we have this amazing machine that has, for the most part, provided pretty reliable service to the vast majority of individuals in this country for a very long time. The challenge is that it is antiquated and needs considerable upgrades. How are we going to do that is still an open question, right? But we have to recognize that it's a dynamic and changing system, and we need to figure out what the most cost-effective upgrades are going to be so that we can address all of the renewable energy, all of the carbon-free resources that we want to get ourselves to the grid of the future. And utilities are definitely thinking about this. So are vendors for utilities. These are just a few of the recent headlines around AI and what is going on within utility operations. And AI forecasting is being used to increase revenue from batteries in markets administered by the Texas grid operator ERCOT. It's being used to improve weather forecasting. It's being used in smart meters. It's being used to complete power flow studies more quickly. It's being used to develop new scheduling strategies, to model smart grid, to optimize wind farm design and location, to match available renewable power and flexible loads, to manage how we're going to charge electric vehicles, right? Even more mundane, AI being used to determine where we actually need to do more vegetation management, to figure out which trees are most likely to fall during storms and knock out power. It's being used to detect wildfires earlier. So figuring out exactly with sensors, not just looking at smoke, how we actually can stop truly catastrophic events on the grid. It's looking to detect grid defects, so we can fix them before they become catastrophic and a real reliability issue. It's being used to make undergrounding electric lines easier, again, to promote reliability. It's being used to accelerate geothermal exploration. So we know that we're going to need some very reliable, constant generation. Geothermal meets that, but we need a lot more of it, and we need to know where to go explore for it, and AI is working with that. It's also being implemented to help increase the load carrying capacity of transmission lines. So looking at lots of current conditions and actually, instead of using static flows, using dynamic ratings, and a lot of what is going into that falls into this category. We're looking to optimize the placement of solar panels, optimize solar panel maintenance, inspect substations, manage distributed resources. So the list that is being either used already or proposed by utilities and others when we are thinking about our grid and how we're implementing it is very, very, very long. And that's good. That means that we're actually looking to use this technology in a beneficial way for our grid. We should all be thankful that these conversations are happening. But I think that it's important to recognize one significant thing that we had as part of that very, very long list. And that is that the customer was almost nowhere in it. And so we've got some things that are focused on reliability. Certainly, that's what customers care about. But really, vast majority of these uses are really sharing one common characteristic. And that means that they are operational improvements undertaken by utilities. And those utilities are looking to use those operational improvements to save money or increase efficiencies in the operation of their systems in ways that they can specifically control. And very, very, very little of what is being talked about at this point in time is focused on empowering customers. To the extent that we have any that have been proposed, they're very, very limited use cases, and not all of them, I would say, are very powerful. One of the main ones that utilities are seeing is, how can I use this to help customers answer commonly asked questions? Interestingly, one of the utilities that actually put this in place had their AI assistant answering all of the easy questions for customers. And that meant that their human customer service reps basically had to deal with the really hard questions all day long, every day. And the utility actually found a significant decrease in job satisfaction among their customer service staff. And so what they ended up doing is they ended up changing their AI bot to every so often actually let one of the easy questions that the AI assistant could answer actually go to a human person. So that human person had a little bit of a mental break. Improving collection rates. Obviously something that utilities want to do, probably not empowering to the customer, in my opinion. Reducing the number of participants leaving community solar programs. Again, I think that we want people in community solar if that is beneficial to them. But again, this is, for the most part, helpful to the utility or the project developer because then that creates less churn. And so, again, a customer use case, but very much not focused on really making it so that the customer is at the center of that conversation. And if we're thinking about things like meeting basic customer service metrics more cheaply, that really is just something that the utility is going to be focused on so that they can meet the requirements met by regulators. They don't want to be in non-compliance with basic service requirements. If this is a way that they can still meet that requirement and do it more cheaply, again, that's something that they are going to want to do. And where we're seeing really any customer-focused innovation, it's being done by retailers, not necessarily by the utilities. Of course, we don't have retail choice everywhere, even where we officially have retail choice in some states. There isn't necessarily a robust program where you actually do have a lot of customers choosing their retailer. So we're just not seeing innovations around the customer with AI tools at this point in time. And I think a lot of this goes to the way that we have defining characteristics in AI, right? A lot of times we're looking at complex systems. There's lots of dependency on data. There's a lack of transparency, both in terms of what data was used to train the models and what models are being used. We've got autonomous operations, so that can, again, lead to questions around bias and other things. And so I think that part of the hesitancy on the utility side might be that, well, these different characteristics of AI could actually exacerbate the lack of confidence that customers have in their utilities. And while that might be true, I think that there's a lot of ways that customers could actually think that their utility is using these tools somewhat nefariously, right? So if a utility chooses to use AI to optimize its portfolio to keep distributed energy resources and customer DERs off of its system, right? There's no way for customers, or at this point, their regulators, to know that that's taken place. And so the information asymmetries that exist are just going to become more and more difficult to address. Another reason that I think we need to broaden the focus of the intersection of AI and the grid is that we're increasingly looking at inequitable ways that we provide service. So how does the grid of today disadvantage lower income consumers? And if we're thinking about the principles of energy justice, then it would be really a bad idea to go ahead and create AI experimentation on the grid that really relies solely on utilities to do it right? That in some ways is a recipe to just expand the power that monopoly utilities already have in regulatory proceedings and in regulatory schemes. And it also goes against some of the founding principles that are being envisioned for AI, right? We want AI to be democratic. We want it to be of beneficial use for all. And if we're really limiting the use cases just to operations and that don't involve and empower customers, we're actually exacerbating the problem that we have now. We're not making it better. This technology isn't actually going to be furthering energy democracy. And so what are some of the ways that we can think about changing the conversation and really focusing much more on empowering customers using this technology rather than anything else? Well, the first one is really that we need to empower ordinary citizens. If they aim to more fully participate in regulatory proceedings that impact them, what we need to do is use these tools to bolster analytic capabilities, right? And basically what we're talking about is interveners here. So obviously interveners can fully participate, right? They're full participatory parties in these proceedings. And so when you are going to a state PUC, and we can use this technology to help empower citizens to be interveners, right? That's going to have huge benefits for the regulatory decisions that are being made, right? First of all, this is incredibly important for energy justice, right? Intervener participation really is the cornerstone of making sure that our grid and the decisions that are made at the PUC are equitable and lead to the beneficial electrification that needs to happen. And the challenge is that even knowing all of the benefits that can come from intervener participation, focusing on energy justice, we still don't have robust intervener participation in many PUC dockets. And a lot of that is based on both information asymmetry, but also just financial implications, right? It is expensive to do this. And a lot of it is because these proceedings are incredibly technical and complex. And so how do we break down some of those barriers, right? I mean, utilities are able to hire attorneys and expert consultants to build out any rate case, to present, to support, to be available for cross-examination in regulatory proceedings. And they pass all of those costs for the most part onto ratepayers, right? That is a recoverable cost in almost every state. When we think about large customers or industry groups that represent particularly large customers, so large electricity users, they have the same economic resources, right? They're not obviously being paid for by ratepayers, but if they can make a difference in that regulatory proceeding, those experts and attorneys will more than pay for themselves in the lower electricity rates that those large customers have to pay. Smaller customers, public interest organizations, don't have the funding, the time, the expertise to have their specific interests represented. The groups that are focused on trying to be that public advocate, in many cases, really are focused just on cost. They're very one-dimensional in terms of what their concerns are, which in some cases may also support what public interest interveners would want, but certainly is not always fully aligned. And, you know, regulators can't, or in a lot of cases simply won't, depending on the individual state and your perspective, make utilities make the changes necessary to decarbonize our grid without strong interveners. Interveners play really a crucial role in highlighting incorrect, self-serving, overly conservative utility assumptions that then make it so that once those are highlighted, we can ask for other model runs. We can go ahead and demonstrate that there is an acceptable and, in a lot of cases, preferred future than what the utility is perhaps proposing. And in a lot of cases, that alternate is actually less expensive for ratepayers, right? And we see this regularly, right? We see utilities making simplistic assumptions around distributed generation. They make worst case scenario assumptions around distributed generation, even though those are not ever going to happen. And even if they were, we could actually work them out in different ways. So what does that mean that we need to do? Well, because if we have this robust intervener participation, that is going to continue to make it so that we have better PUC decision making, right? It's incredibly important for those other voices to be present as part of the conversation. What does that require, though? That requires data. And unfortunately, right now, a lot of that utility data is often not accessible. we're going to need very granular data to understand the most cost-effective ways to meet our goals, especially around a lower carbon future. And we see this in very stark discussions around transmission, right? We know that utilities have been doing a lot of lower voltage transmission lines because the fact that they don't have to be competitively bid. They just go directly into rate base. However, it is well demonstrated that interregional larger transmission lines are better for ratepayers. And that's both in terms of cost benefit and also reliability. The challenge is, how do we actually put all of the data in a way that makes it so that interveners can access not only what they have access to in a particular proceeding, but has been used in other proceedings in other states, in the same state through time, to make it so that we actually can build up the requisite expertise both quickly, but also to make it so that the data that we would need to counteract some of these utility arguments is not only within the utility's purview. And this is a problem really across not just utilities, but a lot of industries, right? And industry leaders are recognizing AI is going to have a significant impact on their business, right? 90% of corporate leaders basically say AI is going to bring business-altering changes in 2024. But over half of those executives said that they weren't prepared to respond adequately. And this is even more true for utilities because we have a continued and historical lack of organizational competence in terms of data usage and actually getting insights from data that does already exist within the system. And we're going to need that if we are going to deal with both the increasing load that's coming from these tools that are going to get used, but also make it so that that happens in a better, lower carbon way. And the potential for AI in public participation is huge, right? Being able to more quickly find specific information in terms of precedent in a jurisdiction, in terms of other jurisdictions, in terms of what's happening, the data that specific utility proposals are based on, how that goes and mirrors what's happening in other dockets. But again, that data has to be accessible. And when we start seeing regulators mandate that data is available, we see amazing results. So there was a recent study that came out of California that found that utilities could save over $20 billion over the next 2 decades in gas pipeline replacement costs by electrifying groups of buildings. And those groups of buildings would basically be less than 3% of the current installed gas base. But that would be a huge impact, especially as we continue to see wealthier individuals move away from the gas system, and you see lower income residents still using gas, renters especially as well, who don't have the ability to actually electrify, you're going to see a real energy justice issue. So if we can use the data to say, well, here's a way that we can make it so that that $20 billion never actually goes into rate base and has to be recovered from the customers, that is huge. Where else are we seeing data that is already having an impact? One of the places that it's been noted that we see a real lack of data is around utility disconnections. Once we start seeing access to that data, then it's very quickly evident the biases that exist and how those disconnection policies are not necessarily being utilized in a non-discriminatory way. And monopoly utility misuse of data is not new, right? We see monopoly utilities actually redacting information in state level proceedings that has to be public at the federal level. So they have to disclose it at the federal level, but it doesn't matter. We actually see them trying to redact it at the state level. So how then do we address a lot of this? Well, we're going to have to deal with confidentiality. And legislators, regulators, interveners are going to have to become much, much more wary of what utilities consider confidential and what they are allowed to place in dockets that it cannot easily be scraped by the public web. Regulators have long allowed monopoly utilities to claim confidentiality on competitive or commercial grounds. That's ridiculous. These companies have no competition. And so if you're asking for something that would be paid for by ratepayers who must use your service because you are a monopoly and they have no choice, there's no way that there can be a competitive concern with that data. And so in order to make this work, we're really going to have to address the misuse of confidentiality by utilities and make it so that all of that data is public. So if a utility is looking to use something to put into a rate case or a proceeding where there's a rider, then that's going to have to be public. And regulators are going to have to go ahead and make that the new rule. And that's because the harm of keeping it confidential at this point with AI is very, very high. And as data becomes ever more crucial, then the harm just grows. And so regulators are going to need to address that. So if we focus around the public interest, around data policies, around confidentiality, focus on interveners, focus on customers, focus on limiting information asymmetry, we do see a path forward for AI really fostering energy democracy. Of course, as I mentioned, there's lots of other questions around AI and grid use, that energy business models, peak use, we're going to have to deal with all of it. But instead of just focusing on the operational aspects, I think that we really do need to also focus on how this can be a tool for good. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Heather. That was wonderful and a great survey of these issues in the energy space, as well as a real focus on the promise of this possible innovation and how it might play into the public interest and support it, as opposed to be another problem to solve. Although it clearly seems to be, there's quite a few problems associated with this. I have a few sort of starting questions to ask you from the chat, and I can sort of start there by asking you, this is a question: how could AI help customers who are solar net metered? The commenter says that we are solar net metered with battery backup capabilities. Green Mountain Power, our very progressive utility here in Vermont, can discharge our battery to help shave peak loads, although we can decline the discharge if needed. The billing from the utility is complicated, not transparent, and it is difficult to get sufficient explanations. Could consumers have more control over their energy usage, such as dishwashers or charging cars, with AI, without getting the utilities involved?
So like so many things, I think the answer to that is it's complicated. Right? So do I think that in places where we have really significant retail choice, that is a potential? Yes, right? We're already starting to see some firms think about doing exactly that in Texas, which we can all talk about Texas. It is its own unique ecosystem. But one of the things that they do really well is retail choice. Transmission, as long as you're intra, yes. Reliability, oh yeah, it's complicated. So I do think that there is a path forward for that. I think that regulators are going to have to really mandate that utilities are much more transparent in their customer communications. I have familiarity with PG&E's bills, and yeah, it is incredibly difficult when an energy expert has a hard time deciphering exactly what is going on a customer bill. Then I can assure you it is basically impossible for a normal customer to do it. And I think that that's part of the problem. I think that we do need to figure out how we can do better in terms of both explaining why certain things happen for grid operations. So for example, and the person who asked the question might know this, but of course, the reason that Green Mountain Power is interested in using the storage that exists at that location is because if they use it during peak and it ends up being one of the peak hours that's used for transmission charges, right? That decreases the cost across the entire rate base for the next year. And so it can be very beneficial to customers as a whole if Green Mountain Power can actually use that storage during specific times. And that benefits everybody. Now, whether or not that's necessarily clear to the average customer who happens to have a power wall that that Green Mountain Power can discharge is another question, right? And so in some cases, I think that a lot of it is trying to be more helpful to really making it understandable what the utility is doing. And in other cases, if retail rate is what you're always going to be charged at, and if they discharge your battery, it's going to be at something not retail rate, right? Then yes, I'm sure there's going to be a different option for you to figure out exactly what the optimal discharge is if you own that battery, right? And we're starting to see conversations like that in California and in Hawaii because of the fact that the net metering rate has decreased so substantially. And so in California now you're seeing at least 40% of solar installations, home residential, have batteries associated with them for exactly that reason. And so you're starting to see movement in that direction. Now, when it's going to proliferate and be easy enough that you can control it on your smartphone, I think that's an open question. But certainly, I think that once we get smart meter data that actually is accessible by customers, which it's not right now, paired with AI, paired with especially some of the differential rates that we're seeing in terms of peak versus off peak, if you've got time of use rates coming on, then we're going to see things like that start happening and start being offered as services.
Okay, so we're sort of thinking about the data that's being generated by all this. One question that we have is that in the other context that AI is being discussed, there's a lot of consideration of, well, really what the models are doing is crawling a bunch of copyrighted information. And then, in the artistic space, it's sort of these products are essentially taking over, the roles of creatives in writing and graphic arts. Do you have concern in the energy space about sort of where and how AI is sort of crawling data? Like which data's in the models? I can think of that question, the use case you described with the interveners. Well, if the utility information that it's crawling is the sort of the southeast part of the country, you might get a totally different set of answers to your query than if you're looking at the Pacific Northwest or New England or what have you. And so just thinking about what's the base of the model that then might become a little bit of a black box for people.
And I do think that is something that we need to be cognizant of. I mean, obviously there's also some cybersecurity concerns. There are privacy concerns. There's scholars certainly that are looking at both of those issues. I don't so far see that those concerns outweigh the positive that we could have. And I trust me, I hear the creatives, and I play with Claude. That's my favorite. And Claude is not particularly bad at potentially drafting law review articles, right? Which is not great. That's what I do. That's what I love to do. We all want to do this research, right? So the question is, though, how can we actually take that and use it in a way that's beneficial, as opposed to in a way to co-opt people's creative efforts, their research, their jobs? I often joke that I actually just want AI to wash my windows. I need one that does that, not one that actually will draft an abstract for me. But that's not what we've got. And so how do we actually harness that power and use it for the public good, as opposed to not?
So one additional question, I think we have time for maybe one or two more before the end of our hour together. One sort of question I think is about energy usage and how much AI is using and how that gets transparently communicated, and who has the power to address that. It strikes me that different regulatory frameworks have different answers to this question, but I wonder if you have I'm sort of blending two questions together. If you have an instinct or a feeling as to which types of regulatory frameworks and which states, because we've got some many dozens of states sort of doing this simultaneously, figuring all these things out in parallel proceedings that may or may not be talking to each other. Where are the promising places, from your vantage point in terms of getting this power dynamic right?
I don't know that we actually have anywhere that's getting it exactly right now. So I would say that there's at least a couple places where we see glimmers of the right conversations happening. So, one of the main challenges when you drop something like an entire, like 600 megawatts of load in a particular place that didn't have that, right, is a lot of times the distribution system is just not set up for that. And I think the concern for a lot of regulators is that these data centers would be proposed and the utility would go ahead and make grid upgrades to support those. Those grid upgrades would be rate-based, and then that development doesn't occur, right? And so then I'm left with a whole lot of grid upgrades that were not necessarily beneficial. And so I think the ways that we can think about dealing with that are making that particular load actually pay for those upgrades rather than putting them in rate base, which does have a history. We've done that for large smelters and those kinds of things in the past. So it's not like that doesn't have a history associated with it. So I think that certainly that would be a good thing for regulators to require. We're starting to see some inklings of that in different regulatory proceedings. One of the more interesting things that we're seeing is the resurgence of take-or-pay contracts, where some utilities are actually proposing that these data centers, for however long, if the utility, for example, would be building new generation or procuring a PPA that's 15 or 20 years, to meet that load, then that data center would actually sign a contract with the utility that is basically a 90% take or pay. So you either are taking and using the 90% to 100% of what you said that you needed at that location, or you have to pay the utility for the amount that you didn't use up to 90% of that proposed load. Which I think for all of us who know the history of take or pay contracts in the gas transportation space, like that's, the first time you hear, oh yeah, we're going back to take or pay, it's a little scary. And then, you look at that and you're like, okay, well, that actually is a way for the utility to adequately manage risk that the rest of the customers have versus this new load coming in. So I think we're starting to see some conversations. It's not enough based on how quickly some of these data centers are looking to come online. In terms of who actually has the ability to really get at this? That is unclear right now. So even on things like Bitcoin data mining, the EIA attempted to, on an emergency basis for reliability grounds, get information about how much various miners were using in terms of electricity. And their trade association sued, and that effort was totally blocked. And EIA was actually told that they have to basically erase any data that they did manage to collect. So I don't think we've got a good answer to how we're actually going to get a full picture of what data or how much electricity these data centers are using. It's going to have to be piecemeal, and it's not going to be easy, unfortunately.
Well, that might be a fitting way to end it. I feel like that's often the in the energy regulatory space, that's often it's going to be piecemeal and messy and challenging, and
Yep.
it's just going to try to figure it out as they go. It feels like a refrain, but thank you for guiding us through how we should think about that in the context of energy and AI. And so we're out of time for our talk today, but I want to thanks again to Professor Payne for the presentation. And thanks to everyone who's been watching with us today. Our next talk will take place online on Thursday of this week, same time, same place. So have a wonderful day, everyone, and thanks so much.
Thank you.